Was Carter Page an FBI plant? Carter Page, the man who the Steele Dossier and FISA warrant submission was all about, was probably an undercover employee by the FBI, and worked with them in the past to set up surveillance and sting operations for the FBI. Since he was the specific man the FBI, DOJ, and other U.S. intel groups used to obtain their FISA warrant, on concocted, politically motivated, and fraudulent evidence, and since his past in regards to being a specialist for the FBI who set up intel stings for them seems to be accurate, one can't help but wonder if he was once again used by the above-mentioned agencies in order to gain a method of surveilling the Trump campaign, for the deep state. In a counterintelligence operation in 2013, an undercover employee was sent to talk with some Russian nationals who the FBI suspected were Russian intelligence agents, sent to spy on and collect data on economic goings-on in the US, particularly in New York City. The Russian men, Evgeny Burakov, the primary player, Viktor Podoviny, and Igor Sporishev, both of whom escaped charges via diplomatic immunity, according to court documents, were approached by what those same court documents call an undercover employee, or UCE1, who was posing as an analyst at an energy company in New York, and began to try to gain the Russians' trust by telling them that he wanted to work with them to make some money. That same undercover employee, after building a bit of a relationship with the men, gave them some binders which nominally were supposed to be some insider corporate info that UCE1 had written, which would give the Russians a leg up on some of the financial goings-on in his energy company. In 2015, the Russians accepted them so that they could look at the info, but unknown to them, hidden recording devices were also in those binders. The UCE1 said that he wrote them, but took them without permission from under his boss's nose, and though he could leave them with the Russian men for a while, would eventually need them back before his boss noticed that they were missing. From the intel recording devices in those binders, the FBI was able to listen in on the Russians' conversations and what the Russians thought was a bug-proof office room they called the Residentura. The FBI recorded the men admitting that they were Russian agents to one another, and talking about what they could do if they turned the UCE1 to their side, to get more financial info from him in exchange for some payola. That, plus some more details as to the men's former operations on behalf of the SVR, a Russian intelligence agency. The UCE1 eventually took the binders back as per their original agreement, and the FBI began to ramp up the investigation. It resulted in indictments for the Russian man Burakov, who had not contacted the US government and told them that he was working on behalf of a foreign government, which is illegal, and eventually ended up in a plea deal admitting to his crimes and a sentence of 30 months in prison. The term is non-official cover, or NOC, and was a violation of US code if not disclosed, thus illegal and warranting federal espionage charges. The Russian pled guilty based on rock-solid evidence the recordings provided, and after some witness testimony in the grand jury hearing, including testimony by the UCE agent, the case was closed on May 25, 2016. Shortly after, Carter Page showed up as volunteer campaign advisor on foreign policy in the Trump campaign. He was at the time working for a New York energy company named Global Energy Capital, and had an impressive scholastic and educational record in regards to Russia, and energy companies in particular, having formerly worked for Merrill Lynch in Moscow as their liaison to set up investments in energy companies in Russia. After joining the Trump campaign, he attended one meeting in foreign affairs, and then left to give a speech in Russia. This raised red flags within the US intel community, and they apparently began to keep track of Page in order to see if he was a spy. Page himself had talked with the FBI in 2013 and 2015, during the investigation into Russian spies, and was apparently thought to not be a person of interest by those FBI agents at the time. Though it was known that he had talked to the later convicted Russian, his explanation that he merely gave them some documents from his lectures about energy, and were no big deal, was the sum of his interaction with the men. The FBI seemed to think that it was all fine and dandy, and that Page did not know they were spies, or were up to anything untoward, so they did not contact him again in regards to that case. After he joined the Trump campaign in the summer of 2016, suddenly the feds were interested in him again, especially since he took that trip to Russia. They then used the Steele dossier, which was financed as opposition research by the DNC, Clinton, her lawyers, and even the FBI themselves, along with another purportedly concocted dossier written by a DNC activist, and some leaks to the press, to justify the FISA request for a data collection and unmasking warrant against Page. All based on concocted evidence, which we now know was basically all made up to justify the warrant, and none of which was disclosed in the warrant request itself. After being turned down a few times, and with the addition of new amendments, the warrant was authorized after Page had cut ties to the Trump campaign and the data collection began. Via that data collection and surveillance on Page, again who was no longer associated with the Trump campaign at all, US Intel and the FBI were also able to collect data on other Trump campaign members through incidental surveillance. And it seems that they used that data to authorize unmasking requests from the NSA and listen in on and record those other campaign workers. some of which, such as Michael Flynn's phone calls, were then leaked to the press, just as the Steele dossier lies were leaked to the press to bolster the "More Russia" narrative against Trump to begin with. So the entire FISA debacle, with the piss dossier and memo, started specifically and exclusively with Carter Page. Why do we now think that Page was that undercover employee that the FBI used to gather intel on those Russian spies? Because the New York Times said so, with compelling evidence, in an article published on April 4, 2017. In that story, they disclosed that Page met with the Russian agents, gave them some materials related to his scholarly and banking work, and talked to the FBI about his connections with them, and then concluded that Page himself was the UCE-1 agent detailed in the court documents against Barikov. Specifically, court documents do not identify Mr. Page, but the details in a statement he emailed to reporters on Tuesday match the individual described as Mel 1 in the court case. Mr. Page's contact with the Russian spy was first reported on Monday by BuzzFeed News. In a transcript of the conversation included in the court documents, Mr. Podobny tells his Russian colleague that Mr. Page frequently flies to Moscow and is interested in earning large sums of money. Mr. Page was apparently interested in striking a deal with Gazprom, the Russian state-run oil firm, according to the transcript. Mr. Podobny called Mr. Page an idiot, but said he was enthusiastic. Mr. Podobny promised through his contacts with Russian trade officials to steer contracts to Mr. Page. "I will feed him empty promises," he was overheard saying, according to the transcript. In June 2013, the FBI interviewed Mr. Page, who said he had first met with Mr. Podobny at an energy symposium in New York earlier that year. Mr. Page said that he had exchanged emails with Mr. Podobny about the energy business and that they had met in person once to talk about the energy industry, and that he had also given Mr. Podobny documents about the energy business. In his emailed statement, Mr. Page said, "As I explained to federal authorities prior to the January 15 filing of this case, I shared basic immaterial information and publicly available research documents with Mr. Podobny, who then served as a junior attaché to the permanent mission of the Russian Federation to the United Nations." Mr. Page, who at the time was also teaching a course on energy and politics at New York University, said in his statement that he had given the Russian nothing more than a few samples from the far more detailed lectures I was preparing at the time for the students. So the New York Times connected the dots and linked the similarities within the court documents directly to Page himself. Then, of course, spun it to imply Page was a Russian agent in order to further poison the narrative against Trump and imply Page and Trump were dirty Russian agents. So the feds could continue to cast aspersion against Trump. They implied he was working with the Russians on behalf of the FBI, but glossed over that it was at the direction of the FBI, if their assertion was right, and it appears to be accurate. That New York Times story itself looks suspicious, but the facts presented in the story seem to be legit. I think that story might have been one of the many that FBI agent Peter Strzok and his mistress Lisa Page talked about leaking in their now infamous released text exchanges. In there, they admitted to leaking at least one story to the Washington Post. But they seem to imply others had been or would be as well. Was this New York Times story also a plant, made to imply Trump had Russian connections through Page, and while admitting that he was helping the government, glossed over the fact that it appeared he was helping the government by being a direct employee of the FBI? Was Carter Page and a fraudulent FISA warrant the insurance policy Strzok talked about in his text with Lisa Page? If Carter Page really is the undercover employee that gave bugged binders to the Russians and set up the surveillance on them, is it really a jump in logic to think that the FBI used him likewise to justify surveillance on the Trump campaign? That he was a plant sent into the Trump campaign so that US intel and FBI authorities could use him, again, to imply Russian connections and give them a method by which they could spy on political opposition and American citizens? Was Page sent to the Trump campaign to set the FISA warrant up, using a mountain of fraudulent evidence to justify the FISA warrant, so the intel community could gather data incidentally on Trump associates via their paid and confidential employee? It looks like the FBI and DOJ were looking for a legal way to spy on the Trump campaign, nominally to check for Russian influence, but more likely it seems they did it to help their favorite candidate, Hillary Clinton, win the election by salacious rumors and intel leaks to the press. When Trump won anyway, they stepped up the surveillance, and on behalf of their deep state handlers and political masters, tried as hard as they could to turn the surveillance effort into a smear campaign, in collusion with the media, to cast doubt on Trump and try to allow Robert Mueller to work his way up Trump associates, setting process crime traps, in order to eventually set a trap for Trump by which to justify Trump's impeachment. Carter Page appeared in an interview with Laura Ingraham on the Fox News channel, and, though this specific thing did not come up, allusions to it did when Ingraham asked him about when he talked to the FBI about those Russian spies and what Page gave them.
The way, Carter, that you were of interest to the FBI. It predated the relationship with the Trump campaign. It predated that, according to the FBI. So when did you know? Were you ever they ever call you up or try to talk to you or say, what are you doing over there in Russia? You're very well connected. Did they ever approach you?
I've talked to them, and I actually mentioned this. I sent a letter to Director Comey on Sunday, September 25th, 2016, 2 days after the defamatory articles came out against me. And I was, as I mentioned there, I basically told him everything is totally false. If you have any questions about this witch hunt, which is what I called it, please don't hesitate to contact me. I would love to set the record straight and talk with your agents. And as I mentioned in that memo to Mr. Comey, I said, well, I've been in contact with members of the intelligence community for many, many years, and I'd be happy to help out, again, in terms of providing you some accurate insights.
I mean, the way you are portrayed, and people who don't know you, I mean, I guess people just reading this quickly, headline readers, like, oh, Carter Page was a spy for Russia. I mean, well, that's what I think that's what just regular folks who aren't focusing on a lot of these details, that's what they believe. That's what they think.
I mean, that case, I was a witness to, there was a diplomat here in New York who I happened to meet at a conference, and, we struck up a conversation. I met him one time after that. And I actually was teaching a course at New York University that semester, and I just told him a couple things I was telling my students about, and he wasn't really interested, and I sent him a couple of course documents. That
on this list, and your past work that you did in Russia, we'll get into that later, raised a red flag. And the FBI apparently had been watching you for some time, okay? So we fast forward to...
Looking at it, does anyone else notice how Page's microexpressions change whenever the FBI is mentioned? That his eyes light up or bulge up and then quickly go from what looks like nervousness to internal script reading when he tries to explain all that inconvenient stuff away? If Carter Page really was UCE1 in the Russian espionage case, and continued his work as a specialist in opening up surveillance routes into whomever the FBI wanted to spy on, was with the Trump campaign but only attended one meeting of no consequence before going to Russia to speak, and was disassociated with the campaign immediately after, in order for known corrupt members within the FBI and DOJ to gain intel access into the Trump campaign and set up an insurance policy to help Clinton win and throw Trump out, how much worse is this memo story now that we know these new connections? I contend much worse. It has exposed, once again, that the government will abuse any power granted to them when it becomes convenient, even going so far as to use undercover FBI informants to set up illegal surveillance against political opponents. The deep state and their various allies and players have turned the United States of America into a banana republic, into a den of criminals running a scam on everyone else, to take their money, freedom, privacy, and all of their natural rights away forever, so that deep state can obtain and exploit power. This whole thing is disgusting, and heads ought to roll immediately to put a stop to it. The deep state players and their banker, corporate, and political allies need to be purged from the government, federal and state, right now, and barred forever from serving office again. Many, or most, should face charges of treason, as outlined by Article 3, Section 3 in the U.S. Constitution. The FISA court should be done away with completely, as should the vast majority of the apparatus that the government is using to spy on American citizens and abuse their power. So too should the general culture of elitism and secrets, especially state secrets, used to say that American people can't see what the government they control by constitutional fiat and mandate is up to, and give certain powers and authorities to in order to serve and protect in good faith. The government has time and again demonstrated that they can't be trusted to police themselves, or to avoid abusing the power granted to them in said good faith. This needs to come out and be exposed. The abuses and corruption need to not only be stopped, but crushed underfoot, so as to never grow out of control again. Stay vigilant, patriots, because this is merely the beginning, the tip of the iceberg. Prepare yourself, and your family, and all others you care about, for the sting of future revelations, as those will probably dwarf even this massive scandal. It's certainly not a smoking gun, but the person who put this whole thing together, which seems to be whomever was doing the writing and narration for the Headline with a Voice channel, using FBI and DOJ documents, and dominant liberal establishment mass media sources from the New York Times and Washington Post, did a hell of a job, and I think gave us a huge piece of this puzzle. Everyone should go to that channel and watch the vid, go through their link sources, and decide for themselves.